Are you tired of spinning your wheels in terms of finishing projects, making better quality music, or getting that pro mix? Well, in this video, I'm going to go over my top 10 best music production tips that I've learned over the years to help you overcome those obstacles as quickly as possible. The decisions that will eliminate 1,000 future decisions if you catch my drift. So if you're stoked for that, stay tuned. Let's do this awesome new transition. How awesome is that? Awesome. Great. So tip number 1 is to focus on sound source. Okay, so this is especially true if you're recording external audio into your interface to go into your DAW, whether it's an electric guitar, whether it's your vocals, a bass amp, an external synthesizer, some other piece of hardware, a piano, anything of that nature. It's extremely important to focus on the source sound first and foremost, and make any tweaks ahead of time with mic placement, with your gain settings, with any EQ or compression that you want to do ahead of time, to really just think through ahead of time what kind of tone you're going after and to capture the best possible quality sound up front. Because the whole approach of this is that you're making the tonal decisions up front. You're making sure that everything you're capturing right off the bat already sounds great, because a lot of producers make the mistake when recording audio to fix it later in the mix, to fix it with plugins such as EQ, compression, saturation, to manipulate it, all this stuff. However, it's extremely hard to polish a turd or to make something that doesn't sound great already sound great through tools afterwards. So spending the time up front, even if it's moving your mic tiny little increments, whether it's an inch this way, angling it slightly, finding a different place to mic your instrument, changing the tone of your pedal or your amp or whatever it is you're working with, spending the time up front will save you so much time down the line, because when you come to mixing your track and editing your track, everything will already sound 80 to 85% of the way there in terms of tone and sonic quality, and then you can focus on making it sound even better, making it sound that next level, that pro level sound. All right, and this tip also carries over to if you're working in the box. So if you're working with software instruments, if you're working with synthesizers that are in your DAW or plugins or any other kind of sampled instrument that you're using in the computer, you want to take some time to make sure you're picking the right sounds if you're choosing presets, or you want to take the time to really get in the nitty-gritty and find the sound design, change the parameters, edit your own patches, whatever it is, to make sure that the sounds you're using are working well together right off the bat. Because this will save you so much time when you start fleshing out your arrangement, when you start layering other parts and other ideas, adding effects. You're going to have a solid foundation, a sonic bouquet, a sonic foundation, you know what I'm saying? All that stuff. Because if you do that, you're going to have a great sonic foundation to build upon as you move your track towards the finish line. All right, tip number 2 is to capture great performances. Okay, so regardless if you're making programmed EDM music or some crazy experimental stuff, or if you're a singer-songwriter, or if you're an instrumentalist, or if you do everything with a MIDI controller, it doesn't matter what genre of music, you want to make sure to capture great performances. So whether you're playing on a MIDI controller, you're playing an instrument, whether you're penciling in notes with MIDI, it doesn't really matter. You just have to make sure that the end performance of your parts has that human feel. It has some kind of essence to it, has some push and pull. And those great performances are what make awesome sounding recordings, awesome sounding productions. It's what takes it to the next level, because getting a really heartfelt, emotional, convicted performance into your music will translate to the listener when they're listening to your music once it's done. And that's what impacts people. Okay, it's the real trying to translate an emotion, a feeling, tell a story, whatever it is with your music is going to come through that performance. Okay, so if you have to take multiple takes, if you have to take your time to find all the nooks and crannies of really getting really cool articulations and dynamic performances in your song, it is so well worth taking the time to work those things out, because those will lead to the best songs that you will produce is the more time you spend on that great performance. All right, tip number 3 is you must edit. Okay, so no matter what you're doing, after you record audio, after you program your MIDI, you're arranging your songs on the timeline, after all of that is done and you've arranged your song, you have to edit. Okay, you cannot get around it. You have to take some time to go into each individual track, your MIDI tracks, your audio tracks, and crossfade any audio clicks and pops. Make sure that everything is a smooth transition. There's no audio artifacts. And also just making sure that everything is lined up together, because, for example, even if you're recording a professional musician, like a drummer, bassist, guitarist, vocalist, there's going to be tiny timing issues. And if you just do a little bit of editing to bring, let's say, a vocal syllable to land closer to the downbeat of a kick drum or a snare drum, it's just going to translate your whole production so much better, because everything will be hitting in sync versus having those tiny differences. And don't get me wrong, you don't want to edit the humanness that you focused on in the last tip out of your song, but you're going to have to spend some time editing to make sure everything hits together and has the maximum impact while still maintaining the human nuance. And spending the time on editing your productions is a must if you wanted to stand up with every other professional production on Spotify today. So definitely spend some time editing. All right, tip number 4 is to start in big strokes. And I used to fall into this trap so much. I still do from time to time. So when you're starting a production, when you're starting a new idea and you're starting a new project, you want to start thinking in big strokes. You don't want to get too zoomed in onto the tiny details at the beginning. So your snare sound or tiny little nuanced notes in a MIDI loop or an audio loop or whatever it may be, or like really getting the perfectionist mindset and diving into the details and editing all the parameters. You want to avoid that at the beginning and think in more big strokes of what is this song about? What are the main parts? Right? What is the sonic texture? What kind of production vibe are you going for? What is the song about? All those kind of things. What kind of story do you want to tell? And really just kind of starting to get the big picture ideas first before zooming into the details. Because in the beginning, your perspective on your music is actually very unreliable. You can't trust your judgment when you're in the studio creating. So when you're creating, focus on exactly that, creating as many ideas as possible and thinking in big picture strokes, and allow yourself to make mistakes or to be like, I'm going to fix this later, but I just want to keep moving on because I'm in flow state creating ideas. Because on the flip side of that, if you zoom into details too early, it's just going to sap your creativity. It's just going to kill your momentum. If, let's say, you're programming a drum beat, you got a bass line, and then you start going back to your drum beat and tweaking the snare drum EQ and trying to get a perfect sound for it to line up with your bass. And then before you know it, you're thinking about all these tiny little details and you still only have a drum loop and a bass line, right? And this can actually sap your creativity because you're going to start to question what even sounds good anyway without the context of a song, without the context of a bunch of other instruments and parts, which will inform those decisions. So it's just one of those things about avoiding pointless rabbit holes, especially in the beginning of your productions. All right, tip number 5 is to use EQ as a sound shaping tool. So EQ is one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful tool in a mixing engineer, a music producer's arsenal, because aside from fixing issues in a mix or enhancing parts of a sound that you really want to accentuate in a mix, EQ is a super powerful sound shaping tool. So just with a few EQ moves of like high pass filters, low pass filters, notching things slightly up or down, or getting even surgical, you can actually change the tone of all of your sounds to fit well together in a massive way and actually change the character of all of your instruments just with simple EQ moves. All right, so if you filter out the high end of a sound, it's going to change all the harmonics. If you dip out parts of the low end, it's going to change the way the sound impacts. So I encourage you to play around with EQ as a creative tool before you get into the mixing phase, because it is so powerful and underutilized in the production phases. All right, tip number 6, and this one's a huge one, is to tweak your arrangement for the mix. So once you have an arrangement down, you have all these different parts, you have a structure with a beginning, middle, and end. Maybe you tell a story, you're happy with it, all that great stuff. But before you go to the mixing phase, it's a good idea to put the editing hat on and tweak your arrangement to benefit the mix. So for example, if you have a funky bass line that's holding down the low end, it's busy and it's awesome and it's holding down the low end, but you also have a piano track that's noodling in the high end, but the piano also has a bunch of low end keys. But let's say your piano track is also hitting bass notes. Well, at certain parts of the arrangement, the bass notes of your piano track, as well as the busy bass line, might be masking just in terms of musical arrangement. Okay, we're not even talking frequencies, we're not even talking EQ, we're just talking parts working together. And if you have too many parts that are conflicting in the same frequency range, just from an arrangement standpoint, it can actually severely impact your ability to mix it properly, because you'll be fighting to create space in the low end, in the high mids, if there's a bunch of stuff going on. So just simply maybe removing bass notes from your piano track if you have a busy bass line, or shifting notes up or down an octave. Simple stuff like that can go so far to helping you mix just from an arrangement standpoint, right? Because if you have too much stuff happening in a frequency range, you have to make room for all of it to exist at the same time. However, if you scale one up into higher frequencies, or scale it down, or just remove them, simplify it, or alternate them in your arrangement, it's going to make your life so much easier. All right, tip number 7 is rabbit holes. Rabbit holes, rabbit holes. If you've been producing for any amount of time, you are very aware of the detrimental power of rabbit holes. So this could be falling into the trap of like scrolling through presets, of tweaking an EQ at the wrong time of the process, mixing something in solo, overworking a part, and just losing the flow. Any of these things could be termed rabbit holes. And there's nothing inherently wrong with a rabbit hole, because the intention is that you want to perfect something, right? You want to find the best possible thing, and you're really zooming in to a specific aspect of your music production. The only thing about rabbit holes is they have diminishing returns. So the more you zoom into details, don't get me wrong, great music and great productions has a lot of attention to detail. However, if you get too zoomed into details, it's actually diminishing returns, because the changes you do when you're too zoomed in and you lose the perspective of the bigger project and the bigger thing at hand, or even what impact the tiny changes are making on the big picture, you're going to be ending up tweaking things that either don't change your song for the better. They're either insignificant or they just don't change. It just sounds different, maybe not better. And you're just wasting time on stuff that the listener will never perceive or care about, okay? So again, it's kind of finding that balance of, you want to zoom in on the details that you know are important for your project, but you want to be also very careful about not getting too zoomed into pointless details that are just going to sap your creativity, sap your flow state, suck your time, and either make your song just different, not better, make it worse, or again, it's opportunity cost. The time that you're wasting going down rabbit holes, you could have been using doing stuff that's actually going to make your song like significantly better, like 5 to 10% better. Think about those kind of moves and maybe avoid the common pitfalls, the common rabbit holes that you fall in, and be aware of it. So a good tip for that is, if you're going to go down a rabbit hole, use a timer. Okay, so if you're going to tweak like a snare EQ or some EQ, or try to sound design something with an effect, put a timer for 10 minutes and then work at it. And if you're not getting anywhere, time to move on and focus on something that's going to move the needle. All All right, tip number 8 is to layer sounds or double tracks when you get to the editing phase, the mixing phase of your production. So this is a super, super powerful tool to circumvent a lot of the issues that we find in terms of an arrangement or editing or getting the sound that you want out of something. So for example, if you have some sort of track, let's say it's a synth line, and you love it, but you just want it to have a little bit more oomph, a little bit more impact. So you spend time with a compressor, you spend time with an EQ, and you're trying to get the sound to fit the thing you want, but it already sounds great, so you don't want to ruin how it sounds already. Well, instead of focusing on that one sound source and using the tools to transform it, you can simply duplicate the track. So now you have two of the same, and on the duplicate, you can process it heavily. So you could EQ all the low end out. You could maybe do a high shelf. You could add a saturator. You could blow it out and distort it and make it sound crazy, and then bring the volume down of that duplicate layer and bring it back in at a lower volume with the original. And just thinking in that way is you're duplicating the sound, transforming it, mangling it, and then adding it in at a lower volume to get the sound you want instead of trying to get it out of the original track. And this is super powerful with layering sounds as well. So instead of trying to get one sound layer to check all the boxes, so to speak, right? Like hit the high end shimmer and the reverb tail, but also have the low end, you can simply double it up with another instrument that's taking care of that frequency range and EQ it heavily, and then mix it in at a lower volume and have multiple sounds together that are layered, that are doing all separate jobs for the same musical part, so to speak. And using this kind of thinking and when you're editing and mixing will just change your perspective, because the sky's the limit on what you can do with layering techniques such as that, instead of always focusing on EQ, compression, saturation, etc. All right, tip number 9 is to invest in sounds over effects. Okay, so if you're trying to build up a library of sounds and tools that you can use in your studio to expand your horizon, or let's say there's a specific genre of music you want to make and there's certain sounds that you want to have in your productions, I would suggest that you invest in virtual instruments, so sampled instruments versus effects. And this is for a few reasons. First and foremost, getting sampled instruments allow you a lot more flexibility on what kind of sounds you can get out of it, because you can use effects on those sampled instruments. But multi-sampled instruments typically have a wide range of articulations and dynamics, and it's something that you can get very familiar with and really make it a pillar in your sound if you master a software instrument or a physical instrument, whatever it is, a sound generation source, versus getting too lost in effects and plugins and all those kinds of things. Although those things are really cool in moderation for fireworks and fun things, they will never really make up a core foundational pillar of your sound, right? It might be part of your aesthetic, but effects and sound manipulation tools will always be centered on some sound source, right? So whether it's a certain kinds of samples, right? Sample packs, that kind of thing is a far better choice to invest in sound libraries, virtual instruments versus reverb effects and all these cool but trickery like looping things and choppers and all this stuff. I would definitely bias towards the instruments, because that's going to allow you to kind of build up a repertoire of your weapons, so to speak, right? The things you're familiar with that make up your sound as a producer and an artist. All right, tip number 10, we made it. And this is probably the most important tip, is that you want to maintain objectivity on your work, okay? So as music producers, as artists, as musicians, we are so close to our work that it is very easy to lose perspective on it, okay? To really get way too emotionally attached to things, or to listen to something way too many times where you actually lose the perspective of quality, right? You actually don't even know what good or bad is anymore, because you're so close to something and you've lost objectivity on it. So this can happen by listening to your music too much, working on the same project for too long, overworking a part for way too long, spending way too much time on one single focus can really destroy that objectivity. And the reason why it's important is because anybody who listens to your music for the first time is going to hear it for the first time. And that's the perspective they're going to have. And the more and more you listen to your music, you're actually getting farther and farther away from how it would sound like the first time you'd ever hear it. Okay, so the way I suggest that you maintain objectivity is to build it into your music production system. So the way you approach producing music, the way you approach your projects. And one of the ways that I do this in my workflow and teach my students as well is to constantly shift your focus on different projects day after day and at different parts of the process. And the powerful thing of this is that it's going to allow you to cycle your focus between many different songs and projects at different points of the process. Maybe you're mixing something and you're starting a new project, and then you're arranging a different one, and then you're finding the best ideas of another jam you did, and you're always cycling your focus. And the power of this is that it's going to actually allow you to maintain objectivity because you're going to be focused on different things. And then when you recycle and come back to a project that you had been working on maybe 3 or 4 days ago, you're going to have a clear perspective on that piece of music. And I cannot express the value of this enough, because with a fresh perspective and fresh ears and having worked on other things and then coming back to something, you're going to intuitively know exactly what needs to happen. You're going to be like, oh yeah, I just need to change this, maybe tweak this part of the arrangement. It might need this other part of the song to feel finished. And you're going to have that clarity right away when you start working on that project once again, versus if you're beating your head against the wall with the same project over and over, you're going to start to lose perspective on what the song actually needs. So that's where that cycling process comes in to help you maintain that ever so precious objectivity, which will save you time in the long run and help you make the decisions that will actually move the needle and help you finish those projects, make better music, and get that pro mix, because you'll have that perspective on it. And hey, if you want to learn more about this whole workflow process, the cycling process I talked about, if you're just getting started with music production, or if you've been at this a while but are having trouble finishing tracks, or hey, if you just want to get a glimpse inside my personal workflow, I've created a super easy to follow 7-step framework that helps you go from your very first ideas all the way to a finished mix and master, all while using that cycling process and using different phases. And I have it in a handy printout that's super handy to have around the studio. So if you're interested in grabbing that, you can find it in the description box below. All right, that wraps it up for this video. Give me a thumbs up if you enjoyed this video. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button if you want to stay in the loop for the next MetaMind Music transmission. And hey, let me know, what is your top music production tip that you've learned in your journey? I would love to know in the comments below. And until the next video, we'll see you in the next one.